body, the IMFC, International Monetary and Financial Committee, representing our 189 members. It demonstrated strong unity of the membership in the face of a serious threat to people and the world economy, clear commitment for action in a coordinated manner. Before I go any further, my deepest sympathy to those affected all over the world. We are determined to act to reduce the risk and impact on people. Let me first frame the objective of this call, the IMFC call. First, to place our scenarios about the potential impact on the global economy in the context of what we know and what we don't know about coronavirus. Second, to concentrate on a framework for how to think about the shocks and how we, the membership, the fund, the World Bank, other organizations, can support those affected by this crisis in an effective and coordinated manner. And third, in that spirit of collaboration, to learn from each other, especially from the countries that are on the front line of response to the outbreak. So what we know? We know the disease is spreading quickly, with over 1/3 of our membership affected directly. This is no longer a regional issue. It is a global problem calling for a global response. We know the outbreak will eventually retreat, but we don't yet know how fast this would happen. We don't yet know how the virus would respond when treatment and vaccine will be available on scale. We know the shock is somewhat unusual, as it affects significant elements of both supply and demand. Supply is disrupted due to morbidity and mortality, but also the containment efforts that restrict mobility and the higher costs of doing business due to restricted supply chains and the tightening of credit. Demand is also falling due to higher uncertainty, increased precautionary behavior, containment efforts, and rising financial costs that reduce the ability to spend. And these effects spill over across borders. What we know from experience in similar crises is that about 1/3 of the economic losses from the disease will be direct costs from loss of life, workplace closures, and quarantines. The remaining 2/3 will be indirect, reflecting a retrenchment in consumer and business behavior and a tightening in financial markets. In other words, the impact of uncertainty. We also know that we have a sound financial system, much more resilient than it was before the global financial crisis. However, what we are wrestling with is uncertainty, and that defines our projections, which at this point lead us to state that global growth in 2020 will dip below its last year's levels, but how far it will fall and how long the impact would be is still difficult to predict. It would depend on the epidemic, and it would depend on the timeliness and effectiveness of our actions. And I want to focus on those. Number one priority in terms of fiscal response is ensuring frontline health-related spending to protect people's well-being, to take care of the sick, and slow the spread of the virus. I cannot emphasize enough how urgent it is for authorities to lean forward in funding outbreak-related health spending, and the need to match demand with supply of the necessary protective and treatment health health products. This is particularly challenging for the countries where health systems are weaker, where response capacity is weaker, and it calls for a global coordination mechanism to accelerate matching demand with supply of what is necessary for the health system to respond. And I can tell you that we, the World Bank and IMF, are stepping in, taking our responsibility for this global coordinating mechanism. Number two, there are macro-financial policy actions to tackle demand and supply shocks that I mentioned before. And the aim should be to stress no-regrets actions that shorten and soften the economic impact, that are timely and targeted to sectors, businesses, and households that are hardest hit. And I was very encouraged to hear during the call countries stepping up exactly that type of targeted, effective actions. Our role is to accelerate the transmission of good practices so the global community can act faster and more effectively. We are faced with a generalized weakening in demand, and that goes through confidence and through spillover channels, including trade and tourism, commodity prices, tighter financial conditions. They call for an additional policy response to support demand and ensure an adequate supply of credit. Third, adequate liquidity will be also needed to offset financial stability risks, and a number of central banks are also stressing contingency planning for situations in which they may be working from home and some disruptions. Very encouraging to hear how seriously this is being addressed. So, in short, it is a fast-evolving situation. It requires a high degree of coordination, and we are determined to deliver on that. So let me finish with how can the IMF help? What is our response? We can be a force of support for our members at risk, those with weak health systems, inadequate policy space, to commodity exporters that are exposed to terms of trade shocks, and to others that are particularly vulnerable to spillover impacts. And I can tell you, both David Malpass and I are particularly concerned about our low-income, most vulnerable members. These countries would see their financial needs rising rapidly as the human and economic cost builds up. We are working to identify highest vulnerability so we can be ready to step up. And for that, we have three sources. One, thanks to the generosity and mobilization of our membership, we rely on $1 trillion in overall lending capacity. Two, for low-income countries and for emerging middle-income countries, we do have rapidly disbursing emergency financing up to $50 billion that does not require a full-fledged IMF program. And 3, we have catastrophic containment and relief trust. It provides eligible countries, these are the poorest of countries, with upfront grants to relieve IMF debt service. We called on our membership to step up. We now have $200 million. We would like to increase this capacity so we can respond to the most vulnerable. So let me finish by saying we are fully committed to support our members. We heard their call today, this morning. We have the tools to help, and we are coordinating very closely with partner institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Managing Director. President Malpass.
Thank you, and thank you, Kristalina, for the cooperation, the coordination, the good working relationship, and I share your expression of sympathies to the families and to the communities that are being affected and will be affected by this tragedy and virus. You were talking about the IMFC, so I want to separate a little bit the governance structure. Yesterday, I presented to the World Bank Group board a policy package, and we announced a $12 billion package yesterday. What the World Bank is doing is working to provide a fast, flexible response based on developing country needs. We'll be bringing virus-related operations forward in March. The speed is needed to save lives at this point, and the breadth of the response is key to its effectiveness. Most effective if it's broad and brings in many countries that are working to reduce the transmission of the pathogens. In order to do that, we're providing technical assistance, also goods and services, so that will help prevent and limit the local transmission, including laboratory equipment and systems to ensure that cases of the virus are promptly identified and traced. Goods such as gloves, masks, portable ventilators, and also health infrastructure such as the stocking of emergency rooms, clinical care, quarantine facilities, and the actual building of those. So those are a core part of the package we announced yesterday, and also the convening with the WHO, where the World Bank Group, IMF, are working closely with WHO on the cooperation with regard to procurement and other important technical matters. We need a system for real-time community-based disease surveillance, and that's conceived in the package that World Bank Group announced yesterday. And so I won't go through all the details with you, but two core things. It's a $12 billion package, of which $6 billion is IBRD and IDA, and that enables and allows special protection for poorer countries. And then there's also $6 billion from the International Finance Corporation. That's critical because it's private sector financing, it's fast acting, and it takes the form of trade finance and working capital finance, which are one of the most needed goods within this, one of the most needed services that can be provided during this crisis. And there can be additional resources on a needs basis. As of yesterday, there were 12 countries that had expressed need. I want to mention also the Pandemic Emergency Financing Facility, the PEF bonds that people have talked about. It may provide more additional resources if it's triggered. So in the explanation of that facility, it's not money coming from the World Bank, but it's money coming into the PEF facility from capital markets. And so that's an important potential source of new assistance. Let me turn now to the economics. The health issues have uncertainty. So do the economic issues. We're doing the World Bank, working with the IMF, doing extensive analysis on global value chains, on tourism, on commodities, the decline in commodity prices, and also the connection to corporate debt. There's the clear need for financing of small businesses and of innovation, and so that is done through short-term floating rate capital financing, which is exactly the instruments the World Bank is using in this. It's important that the fiscal and monetary stimulus not shift resources away from working capital. We want to really find ways to supplement and augment the availability of working capital, which is the capital companies need to import goods to rebuild their inventories. So it's the short-term financing that's critical during a crisis. What we know is that the amount of frozen capital in the world has gone up substantially. And so what we're trying to do from the World Bank side is unlock that capital and allow it to continue into working capital. In sum, the speed and breadth of the response is crucial to its effectiveness. That's what we're set out to do. And then looking beyond, if we can take one moment beyond, it's important to work to increase the resilience to shocks, to improve health systems, and to make growth-oriented structural reforms within economies, and also build this system of working capital that I was describing so that we can leave a faster-growing world after the crisis is passed through. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let's turn to your questions in the room. Please identify yourself by name and affiliation. Keep the questions short, and we'll try and take as many as we possibly can. Let's start in the front row here. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm a reporter from CCTV and CGTN, Gabriel Yingyue. I got two questions. First is that Managing Director mentioned some updates on global economy, and also previously the IMF predicted that the coronavirus situation presents a V-shaped impact on China's economy. And recently, lots of economic activities in China have been resumed. So I wonder if there is any general assessment on the recent economic behavior in China. And also the second question is regarding to President Malpass just mentioned some structural reforms. Now, many countries are dealing with this coronavirus situation. Some are doing relatively well. Some are still facing challenges. I wonder from the perspective of the IMF and the World Bank, has this epidemic situation revealed some vulnerabilities in the global level that need to be tackled in the future? Thank you very much.
Let's start in the front row here. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm a reporter from CCTV and CGTN, Gabriel Yingyue. I got two questions. First is that Managing Director mentioned some updates on global economy, and also previously the IMF predicted that the coronavirus situation presents a V-shaped impact on China's economy. And recently, lots of economic activities in China have been resumed. So I wonder if there is any general assessment on the recent economic behavior in China. And also the second question is regarding to President Malpass just mentioned some structural reforms. Now, many countries are dealing with this coronavirus situation. Some are doing relatively well. Some are still facing challenges. I wonder from the perspective of the IMF and the World Bank, has this epidemic situation revealed some vulnerabilities in the global level that need to be tackled in the future? Thank you very much.
In terms of our projections, we unfortunately over the last week have seen a shift to a more adverse scenario for the global economy. We are working on updating our projections, and we will come up with those in the next weeks in our World Economic Outlook update. As I said in my opening, under any scenario, we see growth in 2020 falling below the level in 2019. For China, we have heard from the Chinese authorities encouraging reporting on restart of production. At this point, they report 60% restart, and they expect in the next weeks to go up to 90%, 100%. This is welcoming news for China, and it is a welcoming news for the world. We would like to get more specificity on understanding of the epidemic before we bring to you an assessment of what would be the letter to use. So bear with us. We will take a bit of time. It is that uncertainty of the spread of epidemic beyond China that we need to carefully reflect on. And to your second question, Mr. Malpass.
Several thoughts on and so as far as lessons learned, it's early. One thing we know is in previous crises, the World Bank was involved and did an extensive evaluation of what tools worked and and so we're drawing on that in creating the response to this current crisis. What we know is information is critical during the crisis and information systems, and then there is the need for countries to prepare to prepare themselves for disasters, because they are not all that rare, and use prevention as the best starting point. And we do have countries that are better prepared for this crisis, and they're able to respond to the crisis more quickly, and that's critical in avoiding the spread. Also, I'll take a note with regard to sanitation and health systems and the need for global expertise applied to those. So a chunk of the World Bank's activity in countries is aimed at the health system and the sanitation systems that are so important. And we have the crisis response window and other specific tools for disasters that are coming into play now. So key point is we evaluate constantly as far as what tools and instruments are going to work best, and then try to evolve that effectively.
Thank you. Let me take Reuters in the front row. Andrea. Andrea, there's a mic here.
Thank you so much. I understand that there's quite a lot of uncertainty and that you're unable to give us specific projections at this point. But can you be a little bit more specific, and can you also explain what it was specifically over the last week that caused this great galvanization of everyone in the entire financial community? I mean, we saw a lot of action yesterday. The Fed lowered rates. Can you say a little bit more, too, about the monetary response? Thanks.
The second part of your question is more straightforward to answer. It is the sheer geographic spread of the epidemic around the world. As I said in the beginning, now we have 1/3 of our membership having experienced cases of coronavirus. It is also the additional knowledge that has been accumulated on how the virus spreads. And it is, unfortunately, spreading undetected more than initially was thought. So the moment it became clear it is no more just about China and maybe a small number of countries in Asia surrounding China, then the outlook on what the impact could be changed. I must stress that we have been looking at different scenarios. We made ourselves clear that in a case that it is only China and it is contained in China rapidly, there could be a milder impact. And then we said it could be a V-shaped impact, but it is no more the case. And that led to the answer to your second question. What we can say with certainty is that we, as we were spelling out, we have a baseline scenario that is relatively mild impact, and then we have more dire scenarios we are considering. Unfortunately, we have moved in the territory of these more dire scenarios. But we want to carefully assess before we come up with projections the two factors that would be determining what we would come up with shortly in the next weeks would be learning more about the outbreak and learning more about actions taken and their effectiveness.
Can I add one thing? Please.
Sorry, just because you ask to be specific. The best specificity I can give you is that what we are assessing now is bottom up on a country level, what is the impact and how that aggregates in our projections. And I want to be very frank. As long as we do not know the duration of this outbreak, we will be in a higher uncertainty space. The positive we saw today, this morning, is a very high degree of mobilization and cooperation, very impressive, and I'm sure President Malpass would have the same take, and measures that are being put in place in a number of countries that are well-targeted measures, and they are going to be helpful to soften the impact and hopefully shorten the duration.
I just wanted to add on the economic side, the global supply chain and recognition of the impact, and then the importance of the private sector in that. So as we prepared our package, this $6 billion from the International Finance Corporation, the private sector arm of the World Bank, is important because it directly addresses some of the supply chain problems that we think are occurring. Thank you.
Thank you. Alfonso, EFE, please.
Hello, Alfonso Fernandez from the Spanish newswire EFE. Yesterday, the Federal Reserve made like an emergency rate cut. Do you think that this cut was appropriate? Do you think that that call has made the markets more confident or more nervous? Thank
you. What is important to recognize is that central banks are closely coordinating with each other, and the degree of coordination over virtually the last days across the world has increased. We do need to have measures that are bringing a sense of confidence, and in that context, different central banks would act differently because they have different space and different priorities in that regard. We are keen to see attention paid on the financial stability, while at the moment the financial system is in a good shape. And I want to stress again, there has been a lot done since the financial crisis to put us on a better footing today. We do need to anticipate risks, and one of these risks would be around access to credit. Not yet demonstrably, but we have to think about it. In the call today, there was a very important message that came from one of our members. And it is, at the time of uncertainty, it is better to lean forward, better to do more than to do not enough. And that applies to health systems, and it applies to policy measures.
And to working capital. So I
Yes,
underscore
and David will score that.
the need for credit, as you said, and the availability of that credit for the short-term growth needs that are out there. Yep. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to take Bloomberg in the front row. Eric.
Good morning. Eric Martin with Bloomberg News. I wanted to ask Managing Director about you've mentioned that there is some degree of unpredictability in terms of the exact levels for global growth with the revisions in the economic outlook. Are we in danger of seeing, is one of the scenarios being studied the possibility of a global contraction? And if you can talk a bit about for both of you, President and Managing Director, about the thought process around the IMFC and the Development Committee meetings, and we understand the virtual meeting format for the broader meeting, but what are the considerations behind what to do with these two particular bodies? Thank you.
Yep. Thank you for the question, and with the risk of repeating myself multiple times, I would stress that at this point, what we are confident to state is that growth this year would fall below the level of last year. And we would need to be carefully assessing bottom-up from analysis of country-by-country data, and of course on a global level, working together with the World Bank, what are the scenarios to present to the public. We, again, with the risk of being very repetitive, it is the duration of the outbreak that is at this moment of time difficult to predict, and it is also, we are at the time when measures are being put in place. We will see demonstrably the effectiveness of these measures over time. What I believe that there is a high degree of cooperation that is, in a moment like this, is absolutely necessary, and it would help us to come through this crisis in a better way. We will talk again. We will come to this.
I'll answer on the virtual question. So with growth below last year, recall it was already slow global growth. So it puts a particular burden on developing countries, on poor countries, and we'll be addressing that in the Development Committee meeting, which occurs in April. And I expect it to be virtual, meaning rather than people convening in Washington, there'll be audio, visual, and the bank has substantial capability. I think we'll have a useful Development Committee meeting under this scenario. But a key point is if growth is slower from an already slow level, that puts a big burden in. I think it's incumbent on people not to have measures taken that channel credit away from the working capital that's so importantly needed. So that's a key criteria in deciding and thinking about measures.
Could I just add on the virtual meeting 2 points? One, this morning we did a dry run, and it was a very effective meeting. We got all the business of the committee done. Two, as we move forward to planning the meetings, we are going to have other focused discussions as well. So I don't want anybody to be left with the impression that we are abandoning the agenda we had for April. We will just change the modality and the format of this agenda. and for those of us who care about fighting climate change, we are going to have a less carbon footprint this spring. Unfortunate event, but with this benefit.
Thank you. Let me take the lady in the second row. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Gary. And I'm Zhang Qi with China-based Taixing Media. My first question is, the Fed cut interest rate by 0.5% yesterday, and we see like the market think it's not enough. Do you recommend the U.S. to further cut interest rate or to do more like fiscal stimulus? And secondly, to those countries without much monetary policy space, do you think it's time for them to do, fiscal stimulus? Thanks.
As I said in my opening comments, we do prioritize macrofiscal measures, first and foremost addressing vulnerabilities of the health system. In other words, we tell finance ministers, instruct the health authorities to urgently finance those measures that are critical for the safety of people. People first, and that means masks, facilities for containment if that is necessary. As Mr. Malpass said, respirators, and the protective equipment so medical personnel can do their job. This is a no-regrets policy, a very good measure. Where we would be concentrated on is to make sure that as our institutions and countries themselves provide financing to buy these goods, they are actually produced and available. And that is the point I made in the beginning about global coordinating mechanism for demand that is of course going up, to be appropriately met by increase of production, repurposing of production facilities if necessary. So we can say the money is here, please produce it ASAP. And the second area of fiscal measures that we recommend are those that are well targeted to address the supply and demand shocks, and already measures of that nature are being put in place in different countries. They are around funding social protection expenditures, making sure that people who stay home because schools are closed, they can have income to support their families, that there is credit available for small and medium-sized enterprises, that there is a restructuring of debt service temporarily, in other words, giving a couple of months, especially for companies in the sectors and the geographic areas most impacted. And that is so very important to do. And then Mr. Malpass would say, and we need to have working capital. So yes, we recommend those measures very strongly.
Yes, and make sure that the central bank actions don't take working capital away from this very pressing need. But I wanted to address, you framed the question in terms of fiscal and monetary stimulus, and I want to add in regulatory stimulus and structural reform. So one of the most powerful things countries can do almost around the world is take actual actions to improve their policies so that the prospective growth rate for their countries can be faster. So rather than think of it as a temporary stimulus, think of it as an investment by the world in growth. Some countries are doing that now, and we're encouraging more to take the important structural reforms and regulatory reforms that enable more supply. Thanks.
Thank you. I want to go online and take a few questions because we've got very many journalists online, and I want to go to other parts of the world. The first question is for both MD Georgieva and President Malpass, and it's on Africa. It's from Today News Africa. How much support can African countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, expect from the IMF and the World Bank to counter this health and economic impact of coronavirus?
We have done a quick assessment of countries at highest risks because of combination of 4 factors: weak health systems, exposure to price shocks because of commodity export orientation, vulnerability due to spillover impacts from other countries, and limited fiscal space. It is unfortunately clear from this analysis that sub-Saharan Africa presents a particularly important area of focus. We do have up to $10 billion available for low-income countries to tap in with 0 interest rates. And obviously we would prioritize countries, especially countries in Africa that have already been faced with difficulties. Some of them are program countries of the fund today. And we have a trust fund that allows for the lowest income countries to pay their obligations to the IMF so they can use this fiscal space to fund priority investments.
Only to add, so the World Bank has both IDA 18 and IDA 19, which are very large funds for poor countries that are fully operational. And one of the things we're doing with the package I announced yesterday is speeding up the reprogramming of that assistance to meet the current crisis. It's based on the needs of the countries themselves, and also is in the context of reforms or of improvements in systems that countries are making in order to either meet their current health needs or look forward at new systems. So there's substantial financing available, and we're accelerating that process through the announcements yesterday.
Thank you. Again, a question for both principals. We're moving to the Middle East. Al Arabiya. What impact could coronavirus have on your projections for the oil-producing countries in the GCC?
We recognize that oil-producing countries have already been hit because of the drop of demand for oil and oil prices. Crude oil prices have already tumbled by more than 15% since the beginning of the year. And that translates into some $10 billion of lost revenues across the MENA oil exporters. What we are looking into is what would that mean in terms of impact on growth. Most of the countries do have buffers, and that is a good time to use those buffers, and we are recommending to everybody they also need to focus on making sure that they prioritize health expenditures first. As with the rest of the world, we would come up with our more detailed projections once we can sort out through the uncertainty today. But obviously growth would be below our earlier baseline scenario.
Okay, there's another question. It's coming from Gigi Press and Nikkei, but it's a broader question than Japan. And it's asking, IMF, you had indicated growth for China would be 0.4 percentage points lower this year. Does that still stand? And how about Japan? And how about Europe? And I guess growth prospects, again, it's a question for both principals.
Well, with regard to our earlier projection for the impact of coronavirus on China, within dropping from 6% to 5.6% growth, that was our baseline scenario, with two very important assumptions: that the crisis is limited to China, it doesn't spread across the world, and that it is fully contained. That has not happened. We have seen this last week that our baseline scenario is no more valid. Already then we looked at adverse scenarios, including for China, in which the impact on growth for China is more significant. The Chinese authorities themselves are recognizing that there would be a lower growth this year. We will have to work on the numbers, but it is very unfortunate that I have to say it, that baseline scenario no longer holds.
I'll just add, information is coming in, and we're assessing and monitoring the situation in terms of growth. But I wanted to make the mention that the private sector is forward-looking, and so important in the growth is what do people around the world think will be the outcome. And so that gets into, you can think of it as confidence, but it's also working capital. It's also the structural reforms and the regulatory reforms that I mentioned. So there'll be a dynamic response from people around the world based on what they perceive to be the actions. And the coordination that we're doing, I think, is intended to show the intent of the IMF and the World Bank on that front. And we've seen the statement from the G7. And I think all of that adds in to the possibility of private sector beginning to think about future investments, even as we're learning more about the extent of the crisis.
If I can make a very important point, and it is, we know from prior experience with these kinds of epidemic outbreaks that they eventually would be retreating, and there would be eventually a treatment, vaccine measures that protect the world. What is hugely important today is to focus on building a bridge between where we are and that time when we would see a recovery, to make sure that the impact in meanwhile is softened first and foremost on people, and also, of course, on businesses and the economy. And this is why I would urge attention to concentrate on action that is done in effective, coordinated manner.
Thank you. I'm going to make that the last response, but I want to give President Malpass an opportunity to...
I thought that was a good close. Agree. I just thank you, everybody, for interest, for being here, and thank you, Kristalina, for leadership and coordination in the IMFC this morning. That body, and we'll be focusing at the World Bank on bringing forward operations over the next just couple weeks, maybe 3 weeks, to be very responsive to the immediate needs of countries as we work together on them. Thanks.
Thank you, President Malpass. Thank you, MD Georgieva. Thanks to all of you for coming today, and for our many friends who have been online today, and we'll be in touch in the coming days. Thanks very much.